Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where women had opinions, feelings, burning desires, and absolutely zero permission to say any of them out loud. We're talking about Victorian England, a time when a woman could not walk into a room, pick up a teacup, or accidentally brush fingers with a gentleman without it meaning something. Something complicated. Something encoded. Something that required a full working knowledge of flower symbolism, fan choreography, and the exact angle at which to tilt your parasol. So before you get comfortable, I want to say a genuine thank you to the viewer who suggested tonight's topic. You know who you are, and honestly, you saved us all from another evening of doing something productive. Your idea is the reason we're here, and this channel only grows because of people like you. If you're new, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. It is always, without fail, 2 a.m. somewhere, and I find that deeply comforting. The channel's also on Spotify now. Link is in the description if you'd rather listen while doing something that only looks like sleeping. Now, dim the lights, put on a fan, pull that blanket all the way up, get yourself horizontal. Because here is what I need you to think about before we begin. Have you ever tried to flirt without speaking? Have you ever had a crush so intense and so socially forbidden that you had to develop an entire secret language just to say, "I think about you sometimes"? Did Victorian women have group chats for this? Or was it more of a pass note situation? Was there a woman somewhere in 1873 who accidentally sent the wrong flower arrangement to the wrong man and accidentally got engaged? Could you sneeze in a way that meant something? Could you accidentally be scandalous just by the way you held a fork? And most importantly, did anyone actually understand any of this? Or was every Victorian drawing room just full of women desperately signalling at each other while the men stood near the fireplace eating crumpets and understanding absolutely nothing? Congratulations, you have just woken up in London. The year is 1863. You're wearing 7 layers of clothing, not one of which is comfortable, and someone across the room is staring at you with an expression that means either "I love you" or "please pass the sugar," and you genuinely cannot tell which. Good luck. Let's talk about flowers, and not in the casual, "oh, how pretty" way. In Victorian England, sending someone flowers was not a gesture. It was a statement, a negotiation, occasionally a declaration of war. Every bloom in every arrangement carried a specific meaning, and the wrong combination could cause a scandal so quietly catastrophic that it would still be whispered about at dinner parties 3 years later. The Victorians called this system floriography, the language of flowers, and it was, without exaggeration, one of the most elaborate communication systems ever devised by people who were technically not allowed to communicate. The roots of floriography stretch back further than the Victorian era itself. It travelled to England through Ottoman Turkey, carried in the letters of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu in the early 1700s. But it was the Victorians who took the concept, ran with it, and sprinted directly off a cliff of complexity. By the mid-1800s, there were dozens of published flower dictionaries available for purchase, which meant that any woman who could afford a bouquet and a small book could theoretically conduct an entire courtship without once opening her mouth. The idea had obvious appeal in a society where opening your mouth, as a woman, carried significant social risk. Here is how it worked. You wanted to send a message to someone. You didn't write the message down because written evidence was dangerous and also possibly intercepted by a mother. Instead, you consulted your flower dictionary and assembled your meaning from petals and stems. Red roses, of course, meant love, but the specific shade mattered. A dark red rose communicated mourning. A pale pink rose said grace and admiration. A yellow rose in many dictionaries meant jealousy or a decline in affection. So if your suitor sent you a yellow rose and you did not know your flower dictionary, you were sitting there in a very good mood, While he was essentially handing you a breakup note wrapped in tissue paper, it gets more complicated. The way the flowers were presented changed the meaning. If a bouquet was handed to you with the flowers pointing upward, the message referred to the sender's feelings. If it arrived with the flowers pointing down, the meaning reversed. You could take a bouquet that said, "I love you," and simply flip it upside down, and it became, "I don't love you." This is either very elegant or a logistical nightmare, depending on how much faith you place in the steady hands of Victorian footmen. Individual flowers carried their own dense histories of meaning. Lavender signalled distrust. Striped carnations meant refusal, a pointed choice if you wanted to reject someone while technically giving them a gift. Ivy communicated fidelity and marriage. Rosemary was for remembrance. Orange blossoms meant chastity and were heavily associated with weddings. Forget-me-nots said exactly what they sounded like. Pansies, from the French word penser, meaning thought, told the recipient that you had been thinking of them, which in a society that barely permitted eye contact was a fairly significant admission. A woman receiving a mixed bouquet was essentially being handed a puzzle. She had to decode every flower, consider the combination, factor in the directional presentation, and then respond in kind, usually by returning a bouquet of her own that said something in the same language. This exchange could go on for weeks. An entire relationship might develop, blossom, and reach the point of something very nearly an engagement, while the two people involved had technically never discussed anything more personal than the weather. The remarkable thing is that it worked. Flowers were given at garden parties, at assemblies, sent to drawing rooms, pinned to letters. Women dried and pressed them and kept them in books for decades. There are Victorian diaries that read like botanical records, entries noting the exact species received, the date, the arrangement, and what the writer understood it to mean. Love stories told entirely in Latin plant names. Rejections delivered in the quiet language of striped carnations, politely, prettily, and without a single uncomfortable conversation. The whole system rested on the assumption that everyone had done their reading, which of course not everyone had. The number of Victorian courtships that must have gone sideways because someone sent striped carnations thinking they just looked nice is a number we will never have access to, and that is probably for the best. You might think of a fan as something you wave at yourself when it's warm. The Victorians thought of it as a full conversation. There was a documented fan language, a codified system of gestures that allowed women to say things in polite company that they absolutely could not say with their mouths. Hold the fan in your right hand in front of your face. I want you to follow me. Draw the fan across your cheek. I love you. Fan yourself quickly. I am engaged. Fan yourself slowly. I am married. Rest the fan on your left cheek. No. And if you snapped it shut with intention, well, that meant something entirely different, and the gentleman who received it knew to take a long walk and rethink his decisions. The fan had been a fashionable accessory in Europe since the 16th century, but it was during the Victorian era that its communicative potential was most thoroughly documented, codified, and exploited. Fans were printed, painted, embroidered, and made from every material imaginable: ivory, tortoiseshell, silk, lace, paper, feathers. A wealthy woman might own dozens. A middle-class woman would own at least one good one for formal occasions and treat it with the care of a cherished instrument, which is more or less what it was. The published fan language guides of the period are genuinely astonishing documents. There were books, actual sold-in shops books, that catalogued fan gestures with the thoroughness of a military field manual. Touching the fan to your lips meant "kiss me," which by Victorian standards was an absolutely shocking thing to communicate to anyone in a drawing room, which is presumably why it needed to be communicated by fan in the first place. Placing the closed fan to your heart meant you have won my love. Opening the fan wide and holding it in front of your face meant wait for me. Dropping the fan meant we will be friends, fanning slowly while. Looking at someone over the top of the open fan meant something that any modern person would describe as flirting, and any Victorian etiquette columnist would describe as a regrettable lapse in self-control. What made the fan especially powerful was that it was always in motion. A woman could make a gesture, make contact, and withdraw behind the fan before anyone watching could be entirely certain what they had seen. The fan was plausible deniability with ivory sticks. You could conduct an entire silent exchange across a ballroom and if challenged claim you were simply warm. Nobody could prove otherwise. The fan was the original private message, and unlike a letter, it left no evidence. The speed of the fanning also carried meaning. A fast fan communicated one emotional state. A slow fan communicated another. There were guides that broke down the number of visible sticks. Fanning so that only one stick was visible between the folds meant one thing, and fanning fully open meant something else. The amount of preparation required to communicate a single coherent message by fan was, frankly, about equal to the effort required to compose a letter, which raises the question of why anyone bothered. And the answer, again, is deniability. Not every woman who held a fan was sending signals, of course. Some women were simply warm. But in a Victorian ballroom, the assumption was always that the fan was speaking, which meant that any woman who picked one up in the presence of eligible company had implicitly entered a conversation she may not have fully intended to start. You could be accidentally flirtatious by the way you cooled your face. You could signal things you did not mean to signal. The fan was powerful precisely because its language was everywhere, and its speakers were not always in control of what they were saying. The whole system required a fluent audience. A fan gesture aimed at a man who had not done his reading was just a woman waving at her own face. But for the women and men who had done their reading, and there were plenty of both, the Victorian ballroom was a place where entire emotional landscapes were mapped in the flicker of ivory and silk, in the time it took to cross a room without a single word spoken aloud. Gloves in the Victorian era were not optional, they were armour. A woman's bare hands were considered surprisingly intimate, the kind of thing you simply did not go around displaying in polite company, as if hands were just hands. Which means that what a woman did with her gloves, specifically, the act of removing them or handing them to someone, or dropping them deliberately, carried a weight that would strike the modern observer as completely insane. Dropping a glove in front of a man was not clumsiness, it was choreography. It was an invitation that he was meant to understand, and if he understood it, he was meant to pick it up, which, depending on context, was either a reply or a proposal. Gloves were worn everywhere, to church, to dinner, to the theatre, to morning calls, to afternoon promenades, and to any event that involved being seen by anyone whose opinion mattered. A woman without gloves in public was a woman who had made a mistake, or a woman who was making a point, and the two were not always easy to distinguish. The gloves themselves communicated social information, their quality, their whiteness, their fit. A pair of tight, perfectly white kid gloves on a woman's hand said something very specific about her standards, her income, and her attention to the details of respectability. The act of putting gloves on was its own small ritual. Women were advised to smooth them on carefully from the fingertips downward, never pulling from the wrist, because pulling distorted the fit. Before a formal dinner, a woman would draw on her gloves with the same deliberateness that a surgeon today might approach preparation, knowing that the hands, once covered, became a different kind of surface. The gloved hand could shake hands in greeting, accept a gentleman's arm for walking, and receive a calling card without any of it becoming charged. The glove was the insulation that kept the social temperature manageable, which is exactly why removing it meant so much. A woman who removed a glove at the dinner table to eat, in a private sitting room among intimates, was entering a different register of interaction. Bare hands at dinner were acceptable because the gloves had to come off somewhere, but the handling of them afterward was watched. Did she set them beside her plate neatly? Did she hand them to a servant? Did she lay them in her lap in a way that suggested she was aware of where they were? All observable, all potentially meaningful. The deliberate drop was its own category entirely. A glove dropped accidentally looked one way, a fumble, quickly retrieved, briefly apologised for. A glove dropped with intention looked almost the same but carried a completely different charge. The slightly too slow release of the fingers, the way the eyes did not follow the glove down, the pause before looking up. A man who understood these signals would pick up the glove himself rather than calling a servant. The act of returning it, the physical proximity it required, the momentary transfer of the object from his hand to hers, was one of the few sanctioned occasions for unscripted touch in a social world that had very few of them. There was also the glove as gift. A Victorian woman who gave a man one of her gloves, a single glove deliberately, was giving him something personal in a way that was hard to explain casually. It was the kind of gift that required a context. It communicated possession of a kind, or at least the offer of it, and a man who accepted such a gift and kept it was indicating that he had received the message and was holding it close. By the end of the Victorian period, the social customs slowly loosened. The language of gloves began to fade. But for most of the century, a pair of women's gloves was doing significantly more work than their ostensible function required. They were managing the distance between people, controlling access, and occasionally, in the deliberate arc of a drop, closing that distance by exactly the length of a reach. There is something almost unbearably funny about the fact that Victorian social life could be entirely derailed by a small rectangle of cardstock. The calling card was the official method by which women, and men, but mostly women, managed their social relationships, signalled their intentions, and communicated things they could not be seen communicating in person. Leaving a card at someone's home meant you had called. Whether the corner was turned down, which corner and how, all of it meant something. There were etiquette books dedicated exclusively to the corners of calling cards. This is not a joke. A woman who turned down the wrong corner was not making a mistake. She was making a statement, whether she knew it or not. The calling card system worked on a principle of managed access. You did not simply arrive at someone's home and expect to be received. You called, meaning you arrived at the door, sent in your card with a servant, and waited to learn whether the lady of the house was at home. She might be physically present and simply not receiving. This was not considered dishonest. It was considered social management, which was a recognised and legitimate activity. If she was not at home, your card was taken anyway, and its arrival was noted, and the fact of your visit was on record even though no visit had technically occurred. The folded corners are where things become extraordinary. The upper right corner turned down meant the card had been delivered in person, rather than sent by a servant. A subtle indication of extra effort, extra sincerity. The upper left corner indicated a congratulatory purpose. The lower left indicated a formal call. The lower right, turned down, communicated a farewell, that the caller was leaving the area or taking leave of the acquaintance. Each corner meant something different, and a woman receiving a card was expected to notice and correctly interpret which corner had been addressed. Cards were left in quantities. When calling at a household, you left one card for the lady of the house, one card for any adult daughters receiving calls, and if the husband or other adult male family members were included in the social relationship, cards for them as well. Miscounting the cards was a social error with real consequences. Leave too few, and you had slighted someone. Leave too many, and you had made assumptions about the depth of the acquaintance that might not be warranted. The card itself was a designed object. The font, the paper quality, the size, the thickness, all communicated the social standing of the bearer before a single corner was folded. A card on very fine stock, engraved rather than printed, with a home address in an acceptable neighbourhood said something specific. A card on thinner paper, with a slightly less fashionable address said something else. Women who are rising socially invested in good cards with the same seriousness they invested in good gloves. The card was the first impression delivered in the owner's absence. Returning a call was obligatory within a specific window, generally within a week. Failure to return a call was a social statement, and everyone understood it as one. It was one of the cleanest ways to end an acquaintance without the messiness of a confrontation. You simply did not return the card, and the message arrived clearly, without a word, without a scene, in the silent accumulation of days in which no card appeared on the hall table. The whole system was a masterpiece of communication by proxy. Feelings, intentions, status updates, rejections and invitations all routed through a piece of cardstock smaller than your hand, managed by servants, decoded by the recipient alone, and filed in little silver trays on hallway tables across England. It was a social network operating entirely by foot traffic and folded corners, and it ran with the efficiency of something considerably more modern. In the 1800s, looking at someone was not a neutral act. Eye contact in Victorian England was a loaded, potentially ruinous, socially complex event, especially for women and especially across gender lines. A prolonged glance from a woman to a man in public was not simply rude. It was, depending on who witnessed it, the social equivalent of lighting something on fire and walking away slowly. Ladies were taught from girlhood to manage their gaze the way a military officer manages a perimeter, knowing exactly where it was at all times, controlling its direction, and never, under any circumstances, letting it wander somewhere that could later require an explanation. The management of the eyes was considered a fundamental component of female respectability. Etiquette guides and conduct manuals of the period return to this subject with a regularity that suggests it was genuinely difficult to get right. A well-bred young woman was expected to hold her gaze modestly downward in public, not so low as to appear shifty, not so high as to appear bold. The ideal gaze, according to these guides, communicated gentle awareness without engagement. You were to suggest that you could see what was around you while simultaneously implying that you found none of it particularly interesting. It was an extremely demanding performance of mild indifference. Direct eye contact with a stranger was essentially forbidden. To hold the gaze of an unfamiliar man for more than a moment was to invite speculation about your character, your upbringing, and your intentions, none of which the speculation would resolve in your favour. Victorian social observers wrote about the bold stare as a specific transgression, the kind of thing that marked a woman as either foreign, lower class, or dangerously modern. The well-managed gaze said, "I am contained. I am appropriate. I am not looking at anything in particular," which made the moment when a woman did look deliberately, directly, with intention, extraordinarily significant. A glance held a fraction too long across a dinner table. Eyes that met and did not immediately drop. The over-the-fan look that fan language guides documented as a specific gesture with a specific meaning. These moments cut through the ambient noise of Victorian social performance with startling clarity because they broke the rule, and everyone in the vicinity knew the rule well enough to notice the break. The eyes could also work in reverse, communicating through the deliberate withholding of contact. A woman who refused to look at someone in a context where looking would be natural was sending a message just as clearly as if she had stared. The avoidance of someone's eyes at a party, after a period of evident interest, was readable as a withdrawal, a cooling of feeling, a disappointment communicated entirely through the management of peripheral vision. There was also the mirror. Victorian homes were full of mirrors, in drawing rooms, in hallways, above mantelpieces, and women who understood the geometry of reflected space could make eye contact with someone while technically looking elsewhere entirely. The mirror glance was an advanced technique. It offered the charge of direct contact with the plausibility that you were simply adjusting your hair. Gentlemen who understood this knew to find a position where mirrors were useful. Gentlemen who did not were probably confused about quite a lot of evenings that had seemed promising and then somehow come to nothing. The Victorian management of the eyes was in the end a form of self-protection. In a world where reputation was fragile and perception was currency, a woman's gaze was one of the few things entirely within her control. It could not be taken from her. It could not be forced in a direction she did not choose. And in those small, precise moments when she chose to use it, directly, deliberately, across a room full of people committed to looking somewhere else, it said everything that the rest of the evening had been carefully arranged to prevent her from saying. Let's talk about walking. You think you know how to walk. You have been doing it for years. The Victorians would like a word with you. The daily promenade, the public walk through parks, along fashionable streets, or around the grounds of an estate was not exercise. It was theatre. Every step was observed, evaluated, and filed away for later discussion. Where a woman walked, with whom, at what pace, and whether she paused to speak to someone she had not been formally introduced to, all of it was data. Women walked in ways that communicated availability, social standing, grief, romance, and disdain, often without exchanging a single syllable. The promenade had designated locations. In London, Hyde Park's Rotten Row was the premier social circuit during the season, a stretch of riding and walking path where the fashionable world went to be seen, which was not the same as going to enjoy fresh air. The timing mattered enormously. The fashionable hours for promenading were specific, and appearing at the correct hour in the correct location in the correct attire communicated that you were a person of leisure with the correct social connections. Appearing at an unfashionable hour suggested that you were either not quite right socially, or that something was wrong, and the whisper network would work to determine which. The company a woman kept on the promenade was a public statement of her relationships. Walking with a mother or a sister said one thing. Walking with a friend said another. Walking with a gentleman who would offer his arm, which she would take or decline, was the subject of immediate observation and subsequent discussion. Who had been seen walking with whom, for how long, and at what distance from each other was the kind of information that travelled from park to drawing room with impressive speed. The social season ran partly on this kind of intelligence. Pace communicated emotional state. A woman walking quickly was either late, distressed, or making a point. A woman walking slowly was either enjoying herself, waiting to be noticed, or both. The deliberate slow walk, the kind that allowed a woman to be observed without appearing to invite observation, was a refined skill. You had to move slowly enough to be seen, quickly enough not to appear to be loitering. You had to appear wholly absorbed in your own thoughts or your companion's conversation, while in fact remaining acutely aware of every other person in the immediate vicinity. It required the sustained concentration of someone diffusing something. The act of acknowledging another person during the promenade was itself governed by rules. You acknowledged by degree a full stop and greeting for intimates, a nod and smile for acquaintances, a brief incline of the head for those you recognized but didn't know well, and a very carefully managed non-recognition for those you wished to snub. The snub, the act of looking directly at someone you knew and showing no sign of recognition, was one of the sharpest social weapons available and could be deployed in full public view with total deniability. You simply hadn't seen them. How unfortunate. Rain was both an enemy and a gift. Rain during promenading hours was an inconvenience that cancelled the performance, but rain that cleared just as the fashionable hour began could mean a smaller, more selective audience, which some women preferred. Too large a crowd and your signals got lost. The right size crowd meant your choices, your company, and your pace were all noted by exactly the people you wanted to have noting them. Walking, for Victorian women, was one of the very few public activities available that offered genuine social agency. You could choose your route, you could choose your pace, you could choose, within the rules, who you acknowledged and who you did not. In a social world that restricted almost every other form of self-expression, the promenade was the stage, and the women who used it well understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you could communicate was simply that you had shown up, on time, looking exactly as you intended to look, and walked away without once looking back. If the fan was a woman's loudest accessory, the handkerchief was her quietest, and somehow more dangerous for it. There was, completely seriously, a handkerchief language. Dropping it on purpose meant one thing. Pressing it to your lips meant another. Drawing it across your cheek, twisting it in your hands, letting it be seen at the edge of your sleeve. Each gesture had a meaning, documented in etiquette manuals, memorized by young women who intended to use them, and presumably completely invisible to every man in the room who had not done his reading. The Victorian handkerchief was a different object from its modern descendant. It was made of fine linen or cotton, often edged with lace, sometimes embroidered with initials or small decorative motifs. It was not primarily a functional item. Sneezing into a good handkerchief at a formal occasion was not really done. It was a carried object, a visible object, something held or tucked or displayed in a way that communicated attention to detail. A beautifully maintained handkerchief said something about its owner, in the same way that well-kept gloves did. It was proof of standards, and standards were everything. The drop was the handkerchief gesture most universally understood and most written about. Unlike the fan drop, which was a slightly larger motion, the handkerchief drop was subtle, the kind of thing that could genuinely pass for an accident if the circumstances required it to. The intentional drop involved a specific release of the fingers, a particular quality of inattention, and then a pause. Not the immediate scramble of someone who has dropped something by mistake, but a beat of stillness in which the opportunity was made available to whomever wished to take it. The man who picked it up and returned it had made a move. The woman who accepted the return had responded. The whole exchange was complete before anyone had opened their mouths. Pressing the handkerchief to the lips was, depending on context, a gesture of emotion barely contained. Women were observed doing this when receiving good news, when trying not to smile too widely, when attempting to manage a feeling that had arrived uninvited and at an inconvenient moment. The handkerchief at the mouth was a physical attempt to hold something in, and everyone watching knew what was being held. It communicated, involuntarily or otherwise, that something had been said or seen that had produced a response too significant to conceal entirely. Twisting the handkerchief in the hands was a different signal, anxiety or distress, or the particular tension of waiting for something that had not yet been resolved. This one was less likely to be deployed deliberately, because it was harder to control, but it was read all the same. A woman twisting her handkerchief while listening to a conversation was a woman who had a stake in the outcome, and the room generally understood this. The embroidered handkerchief as gift had its own chapter. A woman who embroidered a handkerchief with her own hands and gave it to a man was giving him something personal in a way that required no explanation, and yet everyone understood exactly what it meant. She'd spent her time on it. Time was not freely available to Victorian women, and what they chose to do with it said something. A handkerchief worked over in fine stitching, given quietly, slipped into a hand at the end of an evening, was as close to a declaration as the era permitted in most circumstances. What is striking about the handkerchief in retrospect is how much weight rested on something so modest. There was nothing grand about it, nothing spectacular, and yet in the small theatre of Victorian social life, where grand gestures were forbidden and spectacular emotion was considered vulgar, the quiet fold of a handkerchief, the precise placement of it against a pair of lips, the almost accidental release of it from a careful hand, these were the grand gestures. The scale was just different. Everything that mattered happened in small things. Victorian mourning rituals were a language unto themselves, and the women who navigated them were operating inside a system of such staggering complexity that getting it wrong could produce whispers that lasted years. When a woman lost a husband, there was a prescribed period during which she wore full mourning, black crepe, no jewellery, a veil so heavy it was nearly a wall, then half mourning, then lighter fabrics. The duration of mourning, the transition between stages, and the speed at which a widow emerged from black back into colour, told the world everything about her grief, her finances, her intentions, and occasionally her guilt. The official mourning periods were codified with remarkable precision. A widow was expected to wear full mourning for 2 years after her husband's death. The first year demanded black crepe, a flat matte fabric that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, which was the point. Nothing that shone, nothing that caught the eye in any way that might suggest the wearer was interested in being caught. Jet jewellery was permitted because jet was black, but no pearls, no gold, no stones of any warmth. The widow in full mourning was a woman who had, by social agreement, been temporarily removed from the world of the living in any meaningful social sense. The transition to half mourning was watched closely. Half mourning permitted grey, lavender and white, colours that acknowledged a return to the world without fully claiming it. The timing of this transition communicated things that the widow might not have intended to communicate. Moving out of full mourning early suggested that the grief had run its course, which was either a relief or a scandal, depending on the marriage. Staying in full mourning well beyond the expected period communicated either profound devotion or a strategic understanding that visible grief was socially protective. A widow still in full black 2.5 years after bereavement was a woman no one could accuse of anything. Different losses had different prescribed durations, and the hierarchy of grief was formally established. A husband warranted 2 years, a parent warranted 1 year, a sibling 6 months to a year, a cousin a matter of weeks. Children's grief for parents was slightly more complex, and society had opinions about it. Deviating from these timelines in either direction was noticed and discussed. A woman who wore grey too soon after losing a parent was either inconsiderate or had not been especially close. A woman who wore mourning longer than the prescribed period for a distant relative was either overdramatic or making some kind of point, and speculation would eventually settle on which. The material of mourning clothing was itself a communication. Crepe was mandatory for full mourning and was actively unpleasant to wear, rough, clinging, prone to frizzing in damp weather, which in England was most weather. This discomfort was not incidental. The physical unpleasantness of mourning dress was part of the point. Grief was meant to be felt in the body as well as the heart. There were even mourning warehouses, actual establishments that sold the full range of mourning goods, to which women were expected to make pilgrimages within days of a bereavement to ensure they were appropriately outfitted before anyone came to call. The social re-emergence of a widow was a process negotiated with considerable care. Attending church was permitted throughout. Attending social events was not permitted during full mourning. The gradual return, first to small gatherings, then to larger ones, eventually to events where entertainment and potential remarriage both lurked, was mapped against the morning timeline with everyone watching to see whether it proceeded correctly. A widow who attended a ball in lavender 6 months after her husband's death was not simply poorly dressed. She was making an announcement about her availability, and the announcement had reached everyone in the room before she'd finished her first dance. Here is something the Victorians worried about that nobody worries about anymore: blushing. The involuntary flush of colour that crept up a woman's face when she was embarrassed, caught off guard, or, heaven forbid, experiencing an emotion she had not been given permission to have. Blushing was considered evidence of what exactly depended on who was watching and what they needed to believe. A blush, in the right context, was charming, feminine, modest, a sign of virtue. A blush in the wrong context was practically a confession. Women who blushed easily reportedly lived in a state of low-grade anxiety about their own circulatory system. The Victorian attitude toward blushing was contradictory in the specific way that most Victorian attitudes toward women were contradictory. On one hand, the ability to blush was considered a mark of sensitivity and propriety, proof that a woman was not hardened, not worldly, not the kind of person who had seen enough of life's edges to become impervious to them. A young woman who blushed when a compliment was paid to her was a young woman who was reacting correctly to the world. The blush was evidence of innocence, and innocence was the whole point. On the other hand, blushing was entirely outside a woman's control, which meant it could betray her at the worst possible moments. A blush arriving at an unexpected comment said, "That comment landed somewhere." It said, "Something in what you just said found something in me." For a society organised around the principle that women's inner lives should be invisible unless specifically licensed to appear, the blush was a catastrophic leak in an otherwise well-maintained system. You could manage your words, you could manage your gaze, you could not manage your capillaries. Conduct manuals of the period acknowledged this with a kind of resigned sympathy. Some suggested that the best defence against an inconvenient blush was to remain always in controlled environments, where unexpected comments were unlikely. This advice was, practically speaking, useless, because Victorian social life ran entirely on unexpected comments. Others suggested that a woman who felt a blush coming on could avert it by a sudden change of thought, by mentally removing herself from the moment and replacing it with something neutral, like a mathematical problem or the contents of a prayer. This is also, practically speaking, difficult to execute at a dinner party. The blush became, in Victorian literature, one of the primary markers of female emotional truth. Jane Austen's heroines blush, the women in Dickens blush, the women in Trollope blush, at precisely the moments when the plot requires us to understand that something real is happening beneath the social performance. The blush in Victorian fiction functions as a truth-telling device, the moment when the character's actual feeling breaks through the surface of their social presentation and becomes briefly visible. Readers were trained to watch for it, which means readers of Victorian society were also trained to watch for it. This created an interesting loop. Women who knew they were being watched for blushes experienced more anxiety about blushing, which increased the likelihood of blushing, which produced more information for the watchers than the women had intended to release. The Victorian drawing room was, in this specific respect, a very efficient emotional intelligence gathering operation, and the women inside it were simultaneously the subjects of observation, and entirely aware that they were the subjects of observation, which made controlling the data considerably harder. There were women who turned this around. Some Victorian women understood that a well-timed blush, arriving in response to a compliment at a moment when you wanted the compliment to land, was as powerful as any fan gesture. The blush as signal rather than betrayal. The body doing the communicating that the voice was not permitted to do. Whether it was controllable enough to deploy deliberately is a question the physiology makes complicated. But the intent was there, and sometimes intent is enough. You are sitting in a Victorian drawing room. You're not allowed to voice your opinion on almost anything. You're not allowed to address the gentleman across the room directly. You have a lap full of fabric and an embroidery hoop and approximately 4 hours with nothing else to do. What do you make? Whatever you make, it means something. The Victorians turned needlework into another dialect of the unspoken language women had developed out of necessity. Specific patterns, specific colours, specific flowers stitched with specific threads, gifted to specific people who knew exactly what they were looking at. A cushion was not a cushion. A sampler was not a sampler. A pair of embroidered slippers given to a man was either a declaration of deep affection or a marriage trap, depending on which advice column you consulted. Needlework occupied a peculiar social position in the Victorian world. It was considered an appropriate female accomplishment, patient, quiet, decorative, and productive in a way that did not threaten anyone. A woman with embroidery in her lap was a woman who was visibly occupied, but also visibly available for conversation, which made needlework the perfect social cover activity. You could sit in a room with anyone at any gathering, and the needlework in your hands was your justification for being there and your excuse for looking down when looking down was strategically necessary. It was, in short, genius. The flower language that governed bouquets also governed embroidery. A woman who worked a border of forget-me-nots around a handkerchief she intended to give to someone specific was working with intent. Pansies stitched into a bookmark communicated thought and remembrance. Ivy, which in bouquet language meant fidelity, carried the same meaning in thread. A woman who spent weeks embroidering a complex border of ivy onto a table runner for someone's household was making a quiet statement about her feelings regarding the permanence of the connection. Whether anyone read it correctly was, as always in this system, variable. The making of gifts was where needlework became most charged. A Victorian woman's time was not entirely her own. It was distributed among domestic duties, social obligations, and the management of a household that had claims on her attention throughout the day. Discretionary time, time spent on something purely chosen rather than required, was limited. A gift made by hand therefore represented something specific, an allocation of that scarce resource in a particular direction. When a woman spent her spare hours making something for someone and then gave it to them, she was saying something about how she ranked that person in the private economy of her attention. Slippers were the most discussed example. The embroidered gentleman's slippers, a pair of house slippers worked with a decorative motif, given to a man by a woman who was not his wife or his mother, appeared repeatedly in Victorian commentary on courtship as a significant object. Etiquette columnists debated whether it was appropriate to give them before an engagement was formalised, generally concluding that it was not, which is presumably why it kept happening. The slippers were intimate in a way that was difficult to explain precisely. They were for the feet, they were for the interior of the home, they were made for private wear. A woman who made a pair for you had pictured you in some detail in your own house, at your ease. The sampler, that staple of girls' education, the piece of embroidered fabric on which alphabets, numerals, and improving mottos were practiced and displayed, carries its own emotional history. Girls embroidered their names and dates into samplers that were then framed and hung, recording their existence and their skill at a specific age. The sampler as personal document, as evidence of time and care and learning, was something between a credential and a diary entry. The surviving samplers of Victorian girls are among the most quietly heartbreaking artefacts of the period. Small, careful records of young women working their names into cloth, saying, "I was here, I was learning, I made this." Let's take a moment to appreciate the chaperone, the long-suffering, usually older woman whose entire function in Victorian social life was to be present. That was the job. Just be there. Witness everything. Say nothing. but make sure that nothing unsuitable happened, or if it did, that she saw enough of it to report back to the relevant parties. The chaperone was the original surveillance system, and young women navigating courtship learned very quickly that getting around her was as much a skill as the courtship itself. The chaperone was not a servant and not quite a companion and not quite a family member, though she was often one of the latter two. She occupied a peculiar social position, present in nearly every context where a young unmarried woman might encounter an eligible man, but theoretically invisible in the sense that her role was to enable the social occasion while simultaneously policing it. She sat in the corner at balls while young women danced. She accompanied her charge on walks during which she fell approximately 15 feet behind, close enough to satisfy propriety, far enough to allow a conversation she could not quite hear. She was there at dinner, at the theatre, at afternoon calls, at musical evenings. She was always there. The qualifications for the role were specific. A chaperone was expected to be old enough to be beyond reproach herself, married or widowed rather than single, and possessed of a reputation solid enough to lend its weight to the young woman in her care. An unmarried chaperone was technically a contradiction. An unchaperoned woman could not adequately chaperone another. An aunt was ideal. A married elder sister worked. A widowed family friend of appropriate dignity could serve. The critical thing was that her presence certified the occasion as supervised, which was the entire point of her existence in the room. Young women had complex relationships with their chaperones. Some were genuinely fond of the women assigned to oversee their social lives, older relatives who were warm, discreet, and sensible about the difference between what propriety required and what it actually demanded in practice. A chaperone who understood that 15 feet of distance on a garden path was sufficient, and that looking at the roses while a quiet conversation happened behind her was entirely appropriate, was a chaperone worth having. These women were remembered with affection. A rigid, literal-minded chaperone who stationed herself 3 feet from her charge at all times and joined every conversation was a social catastrophe, and the young women assigned to them suffered for it. The strategic management of the chaperone was consequently a minor art form. Women developed signals to communicate to their chaperones that a particular moment required more distance. A certain look that meant, "Please find something to examine over there." A comment that opened a subject the chaperone was known to find engrossing, ensuring her attention would be occupied for several minutes. The chaperone who understood the system participated in it, maintaining plausible proximity while allowing just enough room for the real business of the occasion to proceed. It was a 3-person choreography, and everybody knew their steps. Men navigated the chaperone as well. A gentleman who wanted to speak privately with a young woman had to work with the architecture of the occasion to create a moment, a turn in the garden, a pause near a window, a movement to another part of the room that the chaperone did not immediately follow. These moments were brief by necessity, which gave them a charged quality that longer conversations in freer circumstances might not have had. Constraint, it turns out, is extremely good at manufacturing intensity. The chaperone system began to loosen toward the end of the Victorian era, as attitudes shifted and women gained slightly more freedom of movement. But for most of the century, the chaperone was the fixed third point in every triangle of courtship, the woman whose presence made the occasion possible and whose slight, managed inattention made the occasion meaningful. A Victorian woman who played piano was not performing, she was speaking. The selection of music for an evening at home was a decision loaded with subtext. The tempo, the emotional register, the choice of piece when a particular gentleman happened to be in the room. Shy, melancholy ballads, playful, spirited dances, something technically demanding that displayed competence without appearing to try. Victorian women weaponized the entire Western musical canon, In service of emotions they were not allowed to name out loud, and the men who understood what they were hearing were considered very perceptive indeed. The piano occupied a central position in the Victorian middle and upper-class home with an almost architectural significance. It was not decoration, though it was decorative. It was the emotional infrastructure of the drawing room, the mechanism by which feeling was introduced into social gatherings in a form that everyone could hear, but nobody was required to acknowledge directly. A woman at the piano was doing something socially sanctioned, even admirable, while also doing something far more personal, and the cover that the instrument provided was both the point and the appeal. Musical education for women was considered an essential accomplishment, ranking alongside drawing and languages as proof of cultivation. But the purpose of that education was not professional. Women did not perform publicly for payment, as a rule, because public performance implied a kind of display that respectable women were not supposed to engage in. The music was for the drawing room, which meant it was for the people in the drawing room, which meant it was always, in some sense, for an audience of specific individuals whose reactions to it mattered. The choice of repertoire was consequently never casual. A woman who sat down to play a tender, yearning ballad on an evening when a particular man was present had chosen that piece. She had not arrived at it by accident. The song's sentiment, the longing in the melody, the words, if it was a song with words, was being offered to the room, which meant it was being offered to everyone in the room, which meant it was being offered to him. And he knew this, and she knew that he knew, and yet nothing whatsoever had been said. Songs with texts were the most direct form of this communication, and therefore the most carefully managed. A woman who sang a love song was singing the words of a poet or a lyricist rather than her own words, which gave her distance and deniability. She was merely interpreting the text, not endorsing it personally. And yet the selection of that text over every other available text communicated something that the deniability could not entirely cover. Victorian parlour song literature is full of pieces about longing, about separation, about hope deferred and feelings carefully contained, subject matter that was unusually available in musical form, as if the entire genre had been developed specifically to give respectable women somewhere to put all the things they were not allowed to say. The physical act of playing was also observable. How a woman moved at the keyboard, whether she played with ease and pleasure or with visible effort, whether her expression remained composed or allowed something to surface in the music, was watched in drawing rooms the way a modern audience watches a performance. Tears during playing were not uncommon and were not considered embarrassing. They were considered evidence of sensibility, which was a valued quality. A woman who felt her own music deeply was a woman who felt, and feeling was not something Victorian society disapproved of in women, provided it was expressed through appropriate channels. The piano was one of the most appropriate channels available. After the music ended, the silence in the room was often more communicative than the playing had been. Whether the gentleman in question applauded warmly, or moved toward the piano to turn pages, or simply sat very still for a moment before speaking, that silence was the reply. The whole exchange, offer and response, had happened in a language that the rest of the room could hear and nobody could quote back at you later. In a world where almost everything was observed, the letter was the nearest thing a Victorian woman had to privacy. A private letter, sealed, delivered, and received without an audience, was where the rules loosened, slightly, just enough to breathe. Women who never once said a vulnerable thing aloud wrote letters of astonishing emotional frankness. They argued in letters. They confessed in letters. They said "I love you" in letters that were then hidden in books, tucked inside corset stays, memorized and burned. The letter was the exhale of a society holding its breath. Letter writing was considered a female accomplishment in the same category as music and needlework, and etiquette guides devoted considerable space to its proper execution. The correct letter was composed on good paper, with a clear hand, in ink that didn't blot, with appropriate salutations and closings calibrated to the exact social relationship between writer and recipient. Too warm a closing to a distant acquaintance was a social error. Too formal a closing to an intimate was a kind of coldness. The grammar of the letter's opening and ending was itself a communication, before the body of the text was even reached. But within those formal boundaries, and especially in letters to intimates, close friends, sisters, beloved cousins, Victorian women wrote with a freedom that their drawing-room behaviour would never have suggested. The letters of Victorian women that survive in archives and published collections are some of the most emotionally direct documents of the period. They complain with force, they express desire, they describe loneliness with precision and humour with sharpness. They say things about the men in their lives, admiration, frustration, grief, that the social code of the era made entirely unsayable in person. The letter was where the constraint briefly lifted. The exchange of letters during courtship was governed by its own rules, and those rules were navigated with considerable creativity. An unmarried woman was not supposed to correspond privately with a man who was not her fiancé or a close family relation. The private letter to an eligible man was technically a breach of propriety, one that required either an existing engagement to justify it, or a chaperone's knowledge of the correspondence to legitimize it. This meant that letters exchanged during the early stages of courtship were often managed through third parties: a sympathetic friend who received and forwarded correspondence, a family member who looked the other way. The Victorian postal system was full of letters that were officially addressed to one person and intended for another. When a private correspondence was permitted, either during an official engagement or in the more elastic privacy of a deep friendship, the letters themselves became the primary site of emotional life. Couples who could not speak freely in person wrote to each other with a directness that stands in stark contrast to their drawing-room behaviour. Letters from the period that have survived in collections show men and women saying things to each other on paper that they demonstrably never said aloud: declarations of feeling, expressions of need, admissions of jealousy and longing, and the specific quiet pain of long separation. The letter was the only private space available, and both parties understood this. The burning of letters was a ritual at the end of relationships, before marriages to other people, and in the weeks following deaths. The request to burn letters, sometimes included in wills, sometimes delivered in the last communications of a dying person, was a recognition that the letters contained a truer version of a life than the official record preserved. Families burned letters to protect reputations. Individuals burned letters to protect memories. Some letters survived by accident, hidden too well to be found until decades later, surfacing in old desks and book spines and the backs of drawers, still carrying the specific weight of things said in private that had not been meant for the present to read. They are, without exception, the most alive documents that the Victorian era left behind. The parasol had a practical purpose, which was to protect a Victorian woman's complexion from the sun because a tan suggested outdoor labour, and outdoor labour suggested you were not wealthy, and not being wealthy was, socially speaking, its own kind of catastrophe. But the parasol also had a second life as a communication device: the direction in which it was twirled, whether it was closed and carried, or open and angled, whether it was rested against the shoulder, or carried in front of the body like a small, tasteful shield. All of it legible to someone who knew how to read it. The Victorian ideal of feminine beauty was pale. Not the healthy glow of someone who had been outdoors and enjoyed it, but the cool, almost translucent whiteness of someone who had primarily been indoors, sheltered from the elements, engaged in activities that did not require sun exposure. A woman with a tan was a woman who had been working outside, and working outside was not what ladies did. The complexion was therefore a social document, and the parasol was its daily maintenance tool, which gives it a peculiar double life, both a beauty accessory and a status signal, before it became a communication device on top of all that. Parasols were carried from late spring through early autumn, whenever a woman was outdoors during daylight hours. They came in a range of materials and styles: silk, lace, cotton, lined, fringed, decorated with ribbon or embroidery. A fashionable parasol was a designed object, chosen to complement the dress beneath it. Carrying an unfashionable parasol was a small social failure. Carrying none at all on a bright day implied either that you had forgotten yours, that you did not own a good one, or that you had decided not to care about your complexion, each of which communicated something slightly different, and none of which was the ideal message. The parasol language that developed alongside the fan language and the handkerchief language was perhaps slightly less codified than its siblings. Fewer published guides devoted specific chapters to it, but the gestures were widely understood and widely practiced. Twirling the parasol slowly was a flirtatious signal, the kind of thing that accompanied eye contact and a slight smile. Carrying it closed, resting the tip on the ground while standing, was a posture of composed waiting. Opening it suddenly could be a way of breaking eye contact and ending a conversation without words, a portable wall deployed as needed. Resting it against the right shoulder communicated one thing in some guides. Resting it against the left communicated another. The parasol also functioned as a directing tool. A woman could indicate where she intended to walk by the angle of the parasol's tilt, not obviously, not as a literal pointing gesture, but in the way that a body's orientation announces its intention. The parasol extended that orientation, made it visible across the greater distances of a park or a promenade, allowed a woman to signal a direction to a companion without turning her head or speaking. It was spatial communication, the parasol as a kind of compass needle showing someone patient enough to watch where the conversation intended to go. On rainy days, when the parasol became an umbrella and its social function was replaced by pure practicality, the communication it enabled was lost, which is, incidentally, why Victorian women expressed a disproportionate amount of frustration about English weather. The rain was not just unpleasant. It removed a tool. It forced everything back into the drawing room and the formal channels, away from the open air where the parasol's quiet vocabulary had room to operate. There is probably a metaphor in there somewhere about Victorian women and the weather that somebody should have put in a poem. Several somebodies tried. Where a woman sat at a dinner table was not an accident. The Victorian dinner party seating chart was a document produced with the care and strategic precision of a military campaign, and everyone seated at the table understood that they had been placed there deliberately. Whether a woman found herself beside the interesting new guest or the elderly relative, nobody knew what to do with communicated something about her status, her prospects, and whether the hostess considered her to be in play. Sitting down at a Victorian dinner was like being assigned a position on a board game, and the board game had stakes. The hostess who assembled the seating chart held considerable power, and the good ones understood this power precisely and used it accordingly. The arrangement of guests at a dinner table was not simply about matching conversational interests or balancing gender numbers, though both of those things were observed. It was about social engineering, placing people together who might benefit from the connection, keeping apart those whose proximity would produce tension, and occasionally with intent, sitting a young woman beside a particular gentleman whose availability was known and whose circumstances were appropriate. Matchmaking was a recognised component of the dinner party, and the seating chart was its primary instrument. Precedents governed the seating at formal dinners with a rigidity that would be baffling to a modern dinner guest. The most senior woman present, determined by her husband's rank if she was married, or by her own family connections if she was not, sat at the host's right hand. Rank descended from there in a specific order, and placing someone out of order, either too high or too low, was a social statement. Too high, and you were flattering them beyond their station. Too low, and you were insulting them below it. Either way, you had communicated something, and the surrounding guests had all noticed. For unmarried women, the seating assignment carried specific weight. Being placed beside an eligible bachelor for an entire evening was several hours of enforced proximity, during which conversation was not merely permitted but expected. You could not stare at your soup all evening without it being remarked upon. You could not be rude to your neighbour without it reflecting on your manners. You were in effect required to engage, which made the dinner table one of the more effective courtship mechanisms available, because it created obligation out of geometry. You were simply placed there, and the occasion did the rest. What a woman, discussed over dinner, was its own navigation. The first course demanded light, general topics, nothing controversial, nothing personal, nothing that would establish a tone of inappropriate intimacy before the soup had been cleared. As the meal progressed, the conversation could deepen, carefully, in ways that allowed both parties to express character and intelligence without crossing into territory that would later seem too forward. A woman who was witty at dinner, who could hold a conversation that moved from light subjects into something genuinely interesting, was a woman who stood out. The dinner table was a context in which intelligence was both visible and permitted, which was not always the case in Victorian social life. Moving between courses involved the ritual passing of dishes, the management of wine, the small choreography of shared space at the table, moments of proximity, brief transactions of attention, all of which were observed by the rest of the party whether they appeared to be watching or not. By the time the ladies withdrew after dinner to leave the men to their port and conversation, the seating chart had done its work. Something had either been advanced or declined or simply left in the specific ambiguous state that Victorian courtship preferred, full of potential, empty of commitment, and giving both parties something to think about while the evening continued in the drawing room. If you've never heard of the Victorian postal stamp language, please understand that this is real, documented, and somehow even more complicated than everything else on this list. The angle at which a postage stamp was affixed to an envelope had a meaning. Upside down meant I love you. Sideways meant something else. There were published guides. Women and men were out there, in the 1800s, carefully tilting tiny sticky rectangles with their hearts in their throats, hoping the recipient had done their reading. This was a society so committed to communicating without speaking that it conscripted the post office into the operation. The postage stamp had only existed since 1840, when the penny black was introduced in Britain and the modern postal system was born. Within a generation, the Victorians had done what the Victorians reliably did with any new system that involved objects and social interaction. They had developed an entire secondary vocabulary for it. The stamp language, sometimes called the language of stamps or philatelic language, emerged in the second half of the 19th century and was documented in periodicals, etiquette columns, and small published guides that circulated with the same audience as flower language dictionaries. Young people bought them. Young people used them, or at least they tried to. The system worked on the principle that the placement of a stamp on an envelope was controlled by the sender, and therefore intentional, and therefore communicative. An upright stamp in the upper right corner, the conventional position, meant nothing beyond "this is a letter." But rotate the stamp, and you had said something. Placed upside down in the upper right corner, "I love you." Placed at an angle to the right, "I miss you." Placed in the upper left corner, right back. Placed in the lower left corner, upside down, "I hate you." Placed directly in the centre of the envelope, "Do you love me?" The specific meanings varied somewhat between different published guides, which was either charming evidence of the system's organic development or a logistical nightmare for anyone trying to communicate accurately, depending on your tolerance for ambiguity. The person on the receiving end needed to have a guide. This is the fundamental weakness of the stamp language, its dependence on a shared code book that not everyone possessed. A woman who carefully tilted her stamp 15 degrees to the right and spent the following week in a state of quiet anticipation was assuming that the recipient had either the same guide she did or a compatible one. If he did not, he received what appeared to be a carelessly applied stamp on an otherwise unremarkable letter, and her declaration vanished entirely into the unremarkable. The number of Victorian emotional communications that evaporated because of incompatible guides is a statistic that history has not preserved but imagination can provide. There was also the question of the postal workers. Letters passed through human hands on their way from sender to recipient, and those hands belonged to people who might notice a suspiciously tilted stamp and might or might not understand what it meant. This was less of a concern than with letters, whose contents were sealed. The stamp was visible, but the stamp language was not universally known, which provided its own layer of protection. To the uninitiated, a crooked stamp was a crooked stamp. Only someone who had done their reading could read it. The stamp language sat at the furthest edge of the Victorian communication ecosystem, less widely practiced than fan language or flower language, more likely to produce confusion than clarity, and dependent on a technological innovation that was barely a generation old. But its existence is significant for what it reveals about the culture that produced it. The Victorians were so thoroughly committed to the project of communicating without speaking that when an entirely new object appeared in their social world, the adhesive postage stamp, they immediately asked the same question they had asked of every fan, flower and glove that came before it. What can this say? And then they wrote the guide. The curtsy was not a single motion. It was a spectrum. The depth of a curtsy, the speed of its execution, the degree to which a woman held the position before rising, all communicated social deference, contempt, affection, or ice-cold displeasure, depending on the audience and the occasion. A shallow curtsy to someone who expected a deep one was a public insult so precise it would have been sharper than anything she could have said. Victorian women who had mastered this particular art could devastate a rival with 2 inches of knee bend and maintain perfect deniability for the rest of the evening. The curtsy had a long history before the Victorians got hold of it, rooted in the general principle that a lower physical position communicated respect toward a higher social position. Its origins lay in genuflection, the bending of the knee before figures of religious or royal authority, and by the Victorian period it had evolved into the standard greeting gesture for women across a wide range of social contexts. Men bowed, women curtsied. The gesture was considered feminine and appropriate, a physical acknowledgement of the social hierarchy that Victorian life was organised around, and that everyone was expected to perform with convincing sincerity. The rules governing the depth of the curtsy were broadly understood and specifically practiced. Before royalty, the curtsy was deep and held, a full sink that required practice to execute gracefully and without wobbling, which is harder than it sounds in the petticoats and corsets of the era. A curtsy before the Queen was a physically demanding performance piece, and women preparing for presentations at court reportedly spent weeks practicing it in their drawing rooms, assisted by mothers and aunts, who checked the depth, the steadiness, and the angle of the head. Getting it wrong at a royal presentation was the kind of social event that followed a woman for years. Below the level of royalty, the gradations were finer and more socially loaded. A deep, warm curtsy to a social equal was an expression of genuine affection. the physical equivalent of an embrace in a context where embracing was not always appropriate. A brief, correct curtsy to the same social equal was cordial and adequate, and communicated nothing beyond compliance with form. A curtsy so shallow as to barely qualify as a curtsy at all was a deliberate insult, and every woman in the vicinity could measure exactly how shallow it had been and report back with precision. The speed of the curtsy added another layer. A slow, graceful curtsy with appropriate eye contact communicated composure and respect. A quick, efficient curtsy with eyes already moving on to someone else communicated that the obligation had been discharged and the curtsier had somewhere more important to be. A curtsy performed with slightly too much speed and not quite enough depth communicated something that would take 3 people a full afternoon to discuss, but that everyone present registered immediately as a social temperature reading of approximately below freezing. Young women practiced curtsies from childhood, and the quality of the curtsy was considered a reflection of the household standards. A daughter who curtsied well had been well brought up. A daughter who curtsied badly had not. Governesses taught it. Dancing, masters incorporated it. The curtsy was assessed at every formal occasion in which a young woman was introduced to someone new, which meant that every new introduction was also a small performance review. What is particularly remarkable about the curtsy as a communication system is its combination of mandatory execution and expressive range. A woman could not decline to curtsy. The refusal to perform the greeting at all would have been an extraordinary breach. She had to do it. But within the range of doing it, she had significant latitude. The 2 inches of knee bend that separated a genuine from a perfunctory curtsy were 2 inches of social commentary, delivered in the space of 3 seconds, in public, with total impunity. It was one of the more elegant pieces of social weaponry the Victorian era produced. A Victorian woman's hair was almost never simply hair. Hair up meant she was a respectable adult woman going about her life. Hair down meant she was in a private space, unguarded, possibly vulnerable, or possibly sending a very deliberate signal that should not have been visible to anyone outside the household. The elaborate styles of the period, the coils, the braids, the curls pinned at the neck were not just fashion. They were armour. The moment a woman let that armour down, she was communicating something, and the person who witnessed it was meant to understand the magnitude of the access they had been granted. The transition from girl to woman in Victorian England was marked, among other things, by the hair going up. A young girl wore her hair down or in loose styles that communicated her status as not yet fully entered into adult social life, and therefore not yet subject to all of its rules. When a girl came of age, typically around 16 or 17, her hair went up, and with it went a significant portion of her social freedom. The pinned, coiled, carefully arranged hair of the adult woman was a signal to the world that she was now a full participant in the social system, with all the obligations that carried. The hair up meant, I am accountable, I am visible, I am playing by the rules. The daily construction of the Victorian hairstyle was a serious undertaking. The elaborate arrangements of the period, the smooth centre parts, the coils at the back of the head, the crimped and curled side pieces, the chignons and false pieces added to create volume, required time, skill, and usually assistance. A woman did not do her own hair quickly and alone. She had a maid if she could afford one, a sister or mother if she could not. The process was intimate and private, conducted in the bedroom before the day began, and the result was a public face that would remain in place until the day was done. Taking the hair down was therefore a reversal of all of that, a deliberate dismantling of the public self. It happened at the end of the day, in private, in the bedroom, and was one of the more intimate acts of domestic life. To have your hair taken down by someone other than yourself was a significant intimacy. Ladies' maids did it as part of their professional duties, which is why the relationship between a woman and her maid was considered close and personal, in ways that other servant relationships were not. The maid who unpinned your hair at the end of the evening saw you in a state that was not public, and that required a specific kind of trust. In Victorian literature, the letting down of a woman's hair is rarely incidental. It appears at moments of emotional crisis, of surrender, of grief, of intimacy, and of the crossing of boundaries that the novel is building toward. A woman seen with her hair down by a man who is not her husband is a woman who has been seen too privately, and the narrative consequences follow from that seeing. It is shorthand for a particular kind of exposure, chosen or unchosen, that the reader of Victorian fiction was trained to register as significant. The hair as mourning signal was its own category. Widows wore their hair more severely during mourning, pulled back more tightly without decoration, the elaborate curls of fashionable life replaced by simpler arrangements that communicated withdrawal from the social world that the fashionable hair had participated in. The gradual reintroduction of more elaborate hairstyles as mourning lightened was a visible marker of social re-emergence, watched with the same attention as the shift from black crepe to grey, a calendar of grief charted in pins and waves and the slow return of ornament. The dance card was a tiny booklet, often pretty, always practical, in which a Victorian woman recorded the names of the gentlemen who had requested each dance at a ball, and the filling of that dance card was one of the most watched, analysed and gossiped about activities of the entire social season. Who asked first? Who asked multiple times? Which dances were given to whom? Whether any dances were conspicuously left empty? Whether the same name appeared twice, which was permitted just barely, and noted by absolutely everyone. The dance card was a public document, and everyone who looked at it was reading a story. The dance card, also called a programme, or carnet de bal, was typically a small decorative booklet with a pencil attached, designed to be worn on the wrist or held in the hand throughout the evening. Printers and stationers produced them in quantities during the season, and fashionable examples featured decorative covers, silk tassels and small pencils with ornate handles. The card was an object of some beauty in its own right, which is a somewhat ironic quality, given that its primary function was to manage the emotional economy of an evening with the efficiency of a scheduling system. The mechanics were simple. Before the dancing began, gentlemen approached the women they wished to dance with and requested specific dances. The woman either granted the request, in which case the gentleman's name was written beside that dance in her card, or declined, in which case he withdrew, and she made a note if she was wise. A full card at the beginning of the evening, all dances spoken for before the first had begun, communicated that a woman was popular, sought after, and in possession of a social calendar that others wanted access to. An empty card was a social nightmare that every mother in the room was working to prevent for her daughter. The waltz held a specific position in the hierarchy of dances. It was an intimate dance. The gentleman held the lady, which by Victorian standards was a significant physical proximity, and granting more than 2 waltzes to the same partner in a single evening was considered an indication of serious attachment. 1 waltz was sociable, 2 was noticed, 3 was, by many accounts, as good as an announcement. Women managed their waltz allocations with care, using them to signal interest without overcommitting, granting one and declining a second from the same gentleman if the situation required ambiguity, or granting both if clarity was the goal. The supper dance was the most coveted entry on the card. The dance immediately preceding supper meant that the gentleman who held it would also escort the lady into supper and sit beside her throughout, effectively guaranteeing an hour or more of sustained, relatively private conversation in a semi-public setting. granting the supper dance was a significant gesture, and receiving it was understood as such. Mothers at the edges of ballrooms tracked supper dance allocations with the focus of people watching a very important investment. Declined requests required careful management. A woman who declined a dance from one gentleman was not supposed to accept the same dance from another. If you were too tired or otherwise engaged to dance with Mr. Collins, you could not then be seen dancing that dance with Mr. Darcy. The social logic was that if you had declined, the declination was genuine, and dancing with someone else in the same slot gave the lie to the excuse and constituted a public insult. Managing declined requests while still getting the card filled in the manner you actually wanted required a level of forward planning that would have been impressive in any context. At a Victorian ball, it was simply considered basic competence. Tears were the one emotional response that Victorian women were officially permitted to have, which meant that everything that could not be expressed in any other way eventually found its way there. Crying in the right context was feminine, sympathetic, and morally appropriate. Crying in the wrong context, over the wrong thing, in front of the wrong person, at the wrong volume, was proof of instability, weakness, or something even worse, too much feeling. Victorian women therefore developed an extremely nuanced relationship with their own tears, when to let them fall, when to hold them back, and how to deploy them in a way that said precisely what they needed to say without saying a word. The Victorian period produced an extraordinary cultural investment in female tears. Novels wept, heroines wept, sentimental poetry wept. The woman of sensibility, a figure held up as an ideal since the late 18th century, was a woman who felt deeply and whose feeling expressed itself in tears that evidenced the quality of her inner life. Crying at the right things was proof of refinement. Crying at a church service was appropriate. Crying at a piece of music that moved you was evidence of cultivation. Crying at the news of a friend's misfortune was the correct response to misfortune. Tears were how you showed the world that you were not indifferent, which in a culture that considered indifference a moral failing was a significant social function. But the permission to cry came with detailed terms and conditions. The tears needed to be proportionate. Crying over a genuine grief was appropriate. Crying over a minor inconvenience was evidence of poor regulation. The expression of grief, quiet tears, a slightly unsteady voice, a handkerchief deployed with discretion was the acceptable form. Weeping loudly, becoming visibly distressed to the point of losing composure, crying in a way that required others to manage and comfort you at length was considered a failure of self-governance. Victorian women were expected to feel, but they were also expected to feel in an organised fashion that did not impose excessively on the people around them. There was also the question of audience. Crying before an appropriate witness, a close female friend, a family member, in the semi-privacy of a small gathering, was within the rules. Crying in public in front of acquaintances, at a formal occasion where strong feeling was not expected, was a breach that attracted concern, gossip, or both. The woman who cried at a dinner party was a woman who had lost control of her presentation, and however sympathetic the cause, the loss of control was itself noteworthy. The question that followed was not only why did she cry, but why could she not contain it, which was a different kind of question entirely. The strategic deployment of tears was also a recognised feature of the landscape, documented in novels with both sympathy and satire. The woman who cried to soften a refusal, to avoid a confrontation, or to communicate distress in a context where direct statement was unavailable, was operating within the logic of her environment. If tears were the permitted channel for strong feeling, then the full range of strong feeling would eventually route itself through tears, including feeling that had nothing whatsoever to do with sadness. Frustration that could not be expressed as anger became tears. Longing that could not be named became tears. The Victorian tear was doing the work of a dozen emotions that had been denied their own legitimate forms of expression, and the women who cried them knew this, and the people who watched them knew it too. A formal social call in the Victorian era lasted by convention between 15 and 30 minutes. That was the window. 30 minutes in which a woman was to be charming without being bold, interested without being forward, present without taking up too much space. Every minute was a performance. Everything from the timing of arrival to the choice of topic to the speed at which the tea was finished communicated something about her feelings, her social training, and whether she intended to return. Leaving too quickly said one thing, staying too long said another. The 30-minute social call was a sonnet with an extremely rigid structure and occasionally devastating consequences. The social call existed in a specific register of Victorian life that sat between the formal dinner party and the chance encounter, more deliberate than running into someone at the park, less elaborate than an evening engagement. It was the daily tissue of social maintenance, the mechanism by which relationships were acknowledged, sustained, advanced, or quietly allowed to lapse. A woman who called regularly on a household was a woman who valued the connection. A woman who had not called in several weeks was a woman sending a message, and the message was being received and discussed. The timing of the call within the day was its own signal. Despite the name, morning calls were generally made in the early afternoon, from around 2 o'clock to 5, because Victorian mornings were occupied with household management and correspondence, and the other business of running a life. Arriving before 2 suggested either ignorance of the convention or indifference to it. Arriving too close to 5 suggested that the visit was a social obligation, being discharged at the last possible moment rather than a genuine desire to spend time. The sweet spot, the arrival time that communicated sincere interest without excess eagerness, was somewhere around 3. Women who had been doing this for years knew this without thinking about it, the way a musician knows tempo. What happened in the room during the call was managed with considerable care. The conversation was expected to be light, general topics, shared acquaintances, recent events of an uncontroversial kind. Raising a contentious subject during a social call was a disruption of the form, like playing jazz in a context that required a minuet. The call was not the place for earnest discussions or difficult revelations. It was the place for demonstrating that you were pleasant company, that your social instincts were calibrated correctly, and that being in the same room with you for 30 minutes was an agreeable experience that both parties might reasonably wish to repeat. The tea was a prop as much as a refreshment. Whether it was accepted, how quickly it was drunk, whether the cup was set down before conversation resumed or held throughout, all of it readable. A woman who drank her tea quickly and then placed the cup with a kind of finality was signalling an intention to leave shortly. A woman who accepted a second cup was indicating that she was comfortable, that the visit was going well, that she was in no hurry to be anywhere else. The second cup was, in social terms, a small vote of confidence in the occasion. Departure had its own choreography. A woman who rose to leave at the correct moment, not so early as to suggest boredom, not so late as to suggest she had no other demands on her time, was a woman who understood the form. The goodbye was warm but not effusive. The promise to call again understood as genuine by both parties or understood as polite by both parties, and the distinction between those two readings was one that each woman had to make for herself and act upon accordingly in the weeks that followed. Victorian jewellery had a category that no modern jewellery catalogue could prepare you for: mourning jewellery. Brooches, rings and lockets containing a braid of human hair from a deceased loved one, worn openly in public as a statement of grief and devotion. Yet mourning jewellery blurred at the edges into something even more charged. Jewellery containing the hair of someone who was very much alive. exchanged between two people who were either deeply in love, engaged, or navigating something that did not yet have a name. A woman wearing a locket with someone's hair in it was making a statement. Whether that statement was grief or love depended on context. Sometimes it was both. Hair jewellery had been practised in England well before the Victorian era, but it reached its fullest and most elaborate expression during the 19th century, particularly after the death of Prince Albert in 1861, when Queen Victoria's highly visible mourning made the public expression of grief not merely acceptable, but fashionable. The Queen wore a locket containing Albert's hair for the rest of her life, 4 decades of visible devotion carried on her person, displayed to anyone who looked closely enough. When the monarch herself was wearing a dead man's hair as a brooch to public engagements, the practice was as endorsed as a practice could be. The craft involved in hair jewellery was considerable. Hair could be woven, plaited, coiled, and set into brooches, rings, bracelets, and lockets with the same precision that a jeweller applied to precious metal. Specialist hairwork jewellers operated in cities and market towns, accepting commissions from families who wanted their grief rendered into something wearable and permanent. A well-made hair brooch could contain the braided hair of multiple family members, a kind of portable family archive carried on the body. Some surviving examples are technically astonishing. The hair worked into elaborate floral or geometric patterns that required skill and patience to produce. The locket was the most intimate vehicle. A locket opened to reveal what was inside, which meant that what was inside was private, known only to the wearer, and occasionally to those she chose to show. A woman who opened her locket to show you what was in it was giving you access to something personal, and the request to see inside a locket was itself a significant intimacy. The contents declared something. This person mattered enough to be carried. The hair of a dead husband, a dead child, a dead parent, each was a declaration of the permanence of that bond, maintained on the body as a daily act of remembrance. But the living hair exchange introduced a different charge entirely. A lock of hair given by a living person to another was a gift of something irreplaceable and physical, a piece of the body cut and given deliberately, to be kept close. Lovers exchanged hair. Friends exchanged hair. The exchange of hair during an engagement was common and carried the weight of a physical pledge. You had given someone a part of yourself in a form that could be worn against the skin. A woman who kept a man's hair in a locket before any formal engagement had been announced was a woman who had feelings she had not yet been in a position to express any other way. The locket was the container for what could not yet be said aloud. The management of this jewellery at the end of relationships, or at the beginning of new ones, was its own melancholy business. Hair given during a courtship that didn't end in marriage had to be dealt with. Returning it was one option, fraught with its own complexity. Keeping it was another, complicated by whatever came next. Destroying it was a kind of erasure that not everyone could bring themselves to perform. Victorian women kept things. In old desks and cedar boxes and the backs of drawers, small coils of hair in paper wrappers survived long after the hands that had cut them and the hands that had received them had gone. Victorian women who had mastered polite conversation had also mastered the pause. The silence between sentences was not empty, it was loaded. A pause before answering a question signalled consideration, and consideration signalled intelligence, which was admirable in careful doses. A pause in the middle of a sentence, a moment of apparent hesitation, could communicate reluctance, hidden knowledge, or emotional restraint that the listener was meant to notice and interpret. The Victorians treated conversational silence the way a musician treats a rest in a score, as something that carried as much weight as the notes around it. Conversation in Victorian social life was a performance with rules. And like all performances, its meaning lived not only in what was said, but in how it was said. The rhythm, the pacing, the moments of stillness between the words. A woman who spoke quickly and without pause communicated a kind of unchecked forward motion that was considered slightly unrefined. Measured speech, words chosen with apparent care, delivered at a pace that suggested thought rather than impulse, was the mark of good breeding. The pause was part of the measurement. It showed that you had considered your words before releasing them, which implied that you were a person worth listening to. But the pause was also a tool for managing the information you released. A question asked directly in Victorian social conversation placed the person asked in an interesting position. Answering it fully was the expected response, but a full and direct answer sometimes said more than caution advised. The pause, the moment of visible consideration before responding, created space. It allowed the speaker to edit in real time, to choose the version of the answer that served her best. It communicated, "I am thinking about this carefully before I answer," and thinking carefully before answering implied that the full answer existed somewhere and was being moderated, which was, quite often, exactly what was happening. The pregnant pause was its own specific variant, the silence after a statement that invited the other person to fill it. A woman who made an observation and then stopped, completely, and waited, was performing a kind of conversational pressure. The pause created an expectation of response that was socially difficult to leave unfilled, which meant the other person was likely to speak into the silence, whether they were ready to speak or not. What they said under that pressure was frequently more revealing than what they would have said if they'd been given more time to prepare. The deliberate pause was, in this use, an intelligence gathering technique. There was also the pause as emotional signal. A woman who paused before answering a question about her feelings, or about a particular person, or about an event that mattered to her. That pause was readable in a way that the answer that followed sometimes was not. The pause showed that the question had landed somewhere. It showed weight and significance. It showed that the ground was not as even as the surface of the conversation suggested. A woman who answered immediately and without hesitation was a woman with nothing at stake in the question. A woman who paused, however briefly, had revealed that she did. The conventions of Victorian conversation also gave the pause a protective function. In a world where saying the wrong thing had social consequences that could follow you for years, taking time before speaking was a rational strategy as much as a social grace. The pause was armour as well as art, a half second in which the mental editing happened, in which the thing that should not be said was identified and set aside, and the thing that could safely be said was assembled in its place. The women who had learned this most thoroughly were the ones who seemed most composed, because the machinery of their management was running so smoothly it was invisible. Horseback riding was one of the few physical activities available to respectable Victorian women, and they understood exactly what it meant. To ride well was to display fitness, composure, and a certain kind of fearlessness that was otherwise impossible to demonstrate in public. The horse a woman rode, the style in which she rode it, her control, her confidence, all of it was observed and discussed. A woman who rode brilliantly was showing the world something she could not put into words. And the gentleman who noticed, who sought out a woman specifically at the riding hour, was making his own declaration without opening his mouth. Riding was one of the very few contexts in which Victorian women were permitted to move fast. Side saddle certainly. The convention of riding side saddle rather than astride was firmly established, and the sight of a woman riding astride in public would have produced the kind of reaction that followed you home and into the conversation at the next several dinner parties. But side saddle riding done well was not a constrained or diminished activity. It required extraordinary core strength, balance and horsemanship. A woman who could manage a spirited horse side saddle at a canter was demonstrating physical capability of a fairly impressive order, and in a social environment that rarely gave women the opportunity to demonstrate physical capability of any kind, this mattered. The horse itself communicated. A well-bred horse, sound, well-conformed, well-mannered, was expensive, and its presence under a woman said something about the household that maintained it. A woman who rode her own horse rather than a hired one was a woman of means. A woman whose horse was visibly of good quality was a woman whose family had invested in quality, which was its own kind of credential. The condition of the horse, the quality of the tack, the neatness of the turnout, all of these were assessed by the other riders and the observers at the gates, with a thoroughness that the Victorian leisure class brought to all assessments of all visible things. The riding habit was one of the most architecturally complex garments in the Victorian wardrobe, a tailored jacket and long skirt designed to hang correctly while mounted, to move correctly while walking, and to look impeccable throughout. A well-cut riding habit on a well-mounted woman was a striking combination, and both parties in a potential courtship understood this. The riding hour in Hyde Park, Rotten Row, again, drew observers specifically because the combination of horse and habit and open movement gave women a visibility and a dynamism that drawing room settings simply did not allow. You could see how a woman moved. You could see her in command of something. You could see, in short, a different version of her. The gentleman who appeared at the riding hour, who brought his own horse, who fell into pace beside a particular woman and rode with her for 20 minutes of relatively open conversation, he had placed himself in a specific context. Riding together was socially acceptable in a way that other prolonged proximity was not. The physical demands of the activity gave both parties a reason to be focused elsewhere, which paradoxically created more freedom for the conversation than a stationary setting would have. And the shared competence, the mutual understanding of horses, of pace, of the particular pleasure of moving quickly through open space, created a kind of equality that was harder to sustain in rooms where the social hierarchy was more visible. Women who rode well and loved it understood the freedom it represented in a very direct way. On horseback, you moved through the world at a speed that was your own choosing. You made decisions of direction, of pace, of when to stop. These were small freedoms by any reasonable measure, and large ones by the measure of Victorian women's daily experience. Windows in Victorian domestic architecture were not just architectural features, they were stages. A woman at a window seen but not fully in public, visible from the street but inside the home, occupied an in-between space that carried its own symbolic charge. Being seen at a window meant you could be seen without being, technically, present. It was a way of communicating awareness, of a visitor's arrival, of a gentleman passing at a particular hour, of a situation unfolding in the world outside that you were watching with more than casual attention. Victorian novels are full of windows because Victorian life was full of women standing at them, looking out at things they were not permitted to walk toward. The architecture of the Victorian middle and upper-class home was designed around a particular understanding of the relationship between inside and outside, private and public. The street was public, and the street was male territory in a way that the drawing room was not. A woman in the street was in a context that required management, appropriate dress, appropriate companion, appropriate purpose. A woman at a window was technically inside, technically private, technically contained, and yet she was visible, and yet she was looking. The window was the liminal space between permission and the absence of it. Victorian houses were designed with windows that made visibility possible from both directions. Large sash windows at the front of fashionable townhouses allowed the street to be observed from within, and allowed the interior to be glimpsed from without. Net curtains, The light, semi-transparent fabric that became a fixture of Victorian domestic windows mediated this visibility in a way that served the window's social function perfectly. The net curtain allowed the woman inside to see out without being fully visible to those outside. You could observe the street without being observed observing. You could watch for someone without appearing to watch. The net curtain was, in its quiet way, another layer of the Victorian system for communicating through managed visibility. Being at the window when someone arrived communicated that you had been watching, or at least that you had been near. A woman who appeared at an upstairs window as a caller's carriage pulled up had noticed the arrival. Whether she had been waiting, or whether she happened to be passing was ambiguous, and the ambiguity was useful. The appearance at the window could be either claimed as coincidence or read as intention, depending on what the relationship required at that moment. The window gave you the option. The withdrawing from a window was equally readable. A woman who was visible at a window when someone she wished to avoid appeared in the street had a problem, because having been seen, the withdrawal was itself a statement. To step back from the window was to communicate recognition followed by retreat. To remain at the window but redirect the gaze was a performance of non-recognition that required some skill. To simply continue looking directly was to acknowledge, which opened a new chapter of the exchange. The window placed you in a position where all three options said something, and neutrality was essentially unavailable. In Victorian literature, the window scene is a recurring set piece, because it dramatizes the exact condition of Victorian women's social lives, visible but contained, present but not fully in the world, watching what they were not always permitted to enter. The woman at the window is watching life rather than living it, or living it from a particular remove, and the window frame is the literal architecture of that condition. That writers return to it again and again suggests that it resonated with readers who recognized it, women who knew exactly what it felt like to be at the window, and what it meant and what you were communicating to anyone observant enough to look up. There was an entire vocabulary devoted to the graceful, deniable rejection. A Victorian woman who didn't wish to attend an event, entertain a suitor, or continue an acquaintance had very limited options for saying so directly. What she had instead was the managed absence, the headache that arrived at convenient intervals, the prior engagement that materialized reliably whenever a particular name appeared on an invitation, the series of polite regrets delivered with such consistent warmth that the recipient could not possibly take offense, and yet received the message with complete clarity. The art of the Victorian no was a masterwork of indirection. The formal declining of an invitation required a written response, a note on good paper, in the third person if the occasion was formal enough, to have been issued in the third person, expressing regret and offering a reason of sufficient vagueness to be unchallengeable. Miss So-and-so regrets that a previous engagement prevents her from accepting Mrs. So-and-so's kind invitation for the 14th. Previous engagement, no further detail. The previous engagement could be anything: another dinner, a family obligation, an appointment with a headache that had not yet arrived but was expected. The formulation required no specifics and could not be argued with, which was precisely why it was the standard formulation. The repeated decline was where the communication became pointed. One declined invitation was a scheduling conflict. Two declined invitations from the same person in close succession were a pattern. Three declined invitations were a statement of intent, delivered in the language of regret without a single discourteous word, in a way that gave the person declining complete deniability and left the recipient with nothing to quote back at her. The Victorian no was an art precisely because it communicated its meaning fully while leaving absolutely no evidence of having communicated anything at all. Declining a gentleman's attentions was a more delicate operation than declining a dinner invitation, because the stakes were higher and the feelings involved were less predictable. A woman who wished to discourage a particular man's interest had several tools available. She could be consistently unavailable when he called, the not at home that required no explanation and could be repeated indefinitely. She could be punctiliously polite during social encounters, warm, correct, and entirely unreadable, giving him no encouragement but nothing he could point to as a discouragement either. She could fill her dance card before he reached her and express genuine regret that she had no dances left. She could, over time, simply not be where he was, managing her appearances to create a geography of absence that he would eventually understand as a message. The mother's role in this process was considerable. A mother who wanted to decline on behalf of a daughter who was either too soft-hearted or too inexperienced to manage it herself had all the same tools and considerably more practice with them. Mothers were frequently the architects of managed absences, the composers of regret notes, and the organisers of prior engagements. A mother who told a gentleman that her daughter was engaged for the afternoon, when the daughter was in fact sitting in the back parlour reading, was a mother doing her job. The fiction was transparent. The message was clear. The form was maintained. What the system could not manage was the occasional person who declined to read the message, who accepted all the absences and the filled dance cards and the third-person notes of regret as genuine bad luck, and continued to call. For these situations, the Victorian social code had fewer elegant solutions and more uncomfortable ones, and the discomfort fell, as discomfort in that system generally did, on the woman who'd been trying to communicate clearly and had simply encountered someone with a very high capacity for not hearing what he was being told. Wearing flowers was not simply decorative. A Victorian woman who pinned flowers to her bodice, tucked them into her hair, or wore them at her waist was communicating, and the location of the flowers was part of the message. Flowers worn near the heart meant one thing. Flowers worn in the hair meant another. Whether the flowers had been sent by someone or gathered by the woman herself, whether they were fresh or beginning to fade, whether they were still in bloom when the evening ended, all of it readable, all of it potentially consequential, and all of it deniable if the reading was unwelcome. The wearing of fresh flowers at social occasions was a fashion that peaked in the mid to late Victorian period and required a supply chain, florists, conservatories, hothouses, and the steady delivery of fresh blooms throughout the season. That was itself a marker of social participation. To wear fresh flowers at a ball was to have had access to fresh flowers that morning, which was its own quiet communication about resources and domestic organisation. Artificial flowers were available and were worn, but the distinction between fresh and artificial was noticed, and the fresh flowers carried more weight. The corsage, the small arrangement of flowers worn at the bodice, was the most common form, and its placement and composition were both significant. Worn at the left side, near the heart, the corsage was in the position that love poetry and romantic convention had established as meaningful. Worn higher, near the shoulder, it was decorative rather than symbolic. Worn at the waist, it suggested a different register entirely. Women who understood flower placement placed their flowers deliberately, and women who were given flowers by an admirer and chose where to pin them were making a response. Yes, near the heart, which is where you belong, or higher, which is polite and warm but not what you were hoping for. The flowers given by an admirer for wearing carried the full weight of the flower language, compounded by the act of giving flowers intended to be placed on the body. A gentleman who sent flowers for a woman to wear at a ball was offering something personal and visible. He was asking to be represented on her person during an evening when she would be seen by everyone they both knew. The woman who wore them, and wore them prominently, was accepting that representation publicly. The woman who received them and wore a different set of flowers that evening was sending a message that even the most optimistic reader could not misinterpret. Flowers in the hair occupied a different register, less heart-adjacent, more ornamental but still communicative. In the hair, flowers said something about the spirit of the evening, a lightness, a festivity, a willingness to be decorated that was distinct from the more serious statement of the corsage. Garlands of flowers wound through an elaborate hairstyle were a feature of the most celebratory occasions. A single flower tucked into a simple arrangement was quieter, a choice rather than an occasion, a small declaration of mood or feeling that the rest of the hair's arrangement either complemented or contrasted with. Faded flowers were their own small tragedy. A woman who arrived at an evening event with flowers that were already wilting, beginning to drop their petals, losing the freshness that made the gesture meaningful, was wearing evidence of the morning's enthusiasm meeting the evening's reality. The flowers that were still fresh at the end of the ball, pinned carefully and carried home, sometimes pressed between the pages of a book, were the flowers of an evening that had meant something. The woman who pressed her flowers was the woman for whom the occasion was worth preserving, and the flowers she chose to press from an evening in which she had worn several were the ones that had been given and the ones that had been kept. Behind every one of these systems was a publishing industry working at full capacity to document them. Victorian etiquette books were not polite suggestions. They were technical manuals for social survival, and the women who read them, which was most women, were essentially studying a foreign language. The books covered everything: calling card protocol, morning dress timelines, the order of precedence at dinner, the correct depth of a curtsy by rank, and the specific number of times it was acceptable to waltz with the same man before everyone in the room began making assumptions. The etiquette book was the code book for a civilization communicating entirely in code. The etiquette publishing industry was enormous. Titles proliferated throughout the Victorian period, guides addressed to young ladies, to married women, to those entering society for the first time, to those navigating specific situations like a first season or a new position in a higher social circle. The books were written by women who had navigated the system successfully, and by men who had observed it closely, and the tone ranged from warmly instructional to frankly terrifying. Some read like a sympathetic older sister explaining the rules of a game you were about to play for the first time. Others read like legal documents for a jurisdiction where ignorance of the law was no defence and the penalties were social. The market for these books was driven by social mobility, the steady expansion of the Victorian middle class, which meant a steady supply of women who had not been raised in the upper reaches of the social world and needed to understand its mechanisms before they were required to perform them in public. A family that had come into money, that had moved to a more fashionable address, that had daughters to launch into a higher social sphere than the one they had been born into. These families bought etiquette books the way you would buy a guidebook before a journey to a country where you did not speak the language. The penalty for getting it wrong was not legal, but it was real, and the books tried to prevent it. The specificity of some entries is astonishing in retrospect. Guides explained not merely that you should return calls within a week, but the precise hour at which calling was appropriate and the precise duration that should not be exceeded. They specified the number of calling cards to be left per household visit. They covered the correct form of address for a bishop's wife versus a dean's wife versus a baronet's wife, which are distinctions that required a chart. They explained what to do if you arrived at a dinner party and found yourself seated beside someone to whom you had not been formally introduced, a scenario apparently common enough to warrant specific instruction. The Victorian social world was full of traps, and the etiquette book was a map of them. Women read these books privately and followed their instructions in public while maintaining the appearance that the behaviour was entirely natural and entirely their own. The performance of natural ease in a highly artificial social system was itself one of the system's requirements. You were expected to know the rules so thoroughly that following them looked effortless. A woman who visibly consulted her knowledge of etiquette, who appeared to be thinking about what she was doing rather than simply doing it correctly, had revealed the machinery of her performance. The ideal was invisible competence, which required visible preparation to produce. The books were also occasionally wrong, or at least contradictory. Different guides gave different instructions for the same situations, which is partly why the stamp language had incompatible versions, and partly why some courtships must have produced deeply confusing signals that neither party could explain. The system was documented by many hands and never centrally administered, which gave it the organic inconsistency of a language that had evolved in practice rather than been designed from theory. The etiquette book tried to impose grammar on something that had developed without it, and the result was thorough, useful, and slightly unreliable, exactly like most grammars. Let's be honest about gossip. In Victorian England, gossip was not a moral failing. It was infrastructure. It was how women, excluded from newspapers, business, politics, and most of public life, gathered, shared, and acted on information that affected their futures. Who was courting whom? Who had been seen where? Whose finances were shakier than they appeared? Whose engagement was in trouble? The drawing room gossip network was fast, accurate, and operated by people who had strong incentives to be right, because their own social standing depended on the quality of their information. It was, in every meaningful sense, a news service. The word gossip itself carried a moral charge in the Victorian period that it carries today, and the charge was gendered. Men who exchanged information about each other's affairs were being practical. Women who did the same thing were gossiping. This distinction was made and maintained by a society that had simultaneously excluded women from all of the official channels through which information flowed: newspapers, clubs, parliament, business meetings, professional correspondence, and then criticised them for developing unofficial channels to replace the ones they had been denied. The gossip network was a workaround for a structural exclusion, and it was criticised by the same structure that had made it necessary. What travelled through the network was consequential. Financial information moved through it. Whispers about a family that was spending beyond its means, a business venture that had gone badly, a fortune that was smaller than advertised. This information was relevant to anyone considering a marriage connection with that family, which meant that it was not trivial social chatter, but practical intelligence with real financial stakes. Women who had daughters to settle needed to know the difference between a man who appeared wealthy and a man who was wealthy, and the drawing room network was frequently better at providing this information than any official source. Social mobility information moved through it as well. Who had been received by whom? Whose invitation to a particular event had been declined, and what the declination suggested about their standing? Whose behaviour at a recent occasion had attracted comment? The network tracked the constant microshifts of social position that the Victorian class system generated: who was rising, who was slipping, who was newly acceptable, and who had recently become less so. For a woman navigating this landscape on behalf of herself or her family, this information was not gossip, it was navigation. The reliability of the network was maintained by social consequence. Women who passed on inaccurate information faced the consequences when the inaccuracy was discovered, a credibility loss that could take years to repair. This created a quality control mechanism that operated without any formal administration. The most trusted participants in the network were those with the best track records for accuracy, and accuracy was valued precisely because the stakes of acting on bad information were high. The Victorian gossip network was, in this respect, self-regulating, which is more than can be said for several official information systems of the same period. What the network could not fully protect against was malice, deliberate misinformation spread with intent to harm. The system that efficiently distributed true information was equally efficient at distributing false information, and there were women who used this efficiency strategically. A rumour planted carefully in the right drawing room could travel to every relevant household within a week. Its origins were untraceable, its effects were immediate. The woman who understood this and used it was operating at the far end of the system's capabilities, and the women on the receiving end of it knew what had happened and had very limited official recourse. The gossip network gave and the gossip network took away, and the women who lived inside it had to navigate both directions with equal care. By the time a Victorian woman put pen to paper and wrote a love letter, a real one, sealed and delivered by a trusted hand to someone she had never been permitted to address directly, she had usually already said the same thing 6 other ways, with flowers, with a fan, with the way she placed a glove on a table, with the dance she gave and the one she withheld, with a blush she could not control and a stamp tilted 2 degrees from upright. The letter was the last resort and the first direct line, the moment when all the elegant indirection finally gave way, and a Victorian woman, in the cramped privacy of a writing desk, said the one thing she had been trying to say all along, in the plainest words she had. The love letter occupied a specific legal and social territory in Victorian England that gave it a weight beyond its emotional content. A love letter was evidence. It was proof of a relationship, of a promise, of an intention. Letters exchanged during a courtship could be produced in court in breach of promise cases, legal actions brought when an engagement was broken, and the words written in private became public testimony. This gave the Victorian love letter a quality that love letters in other eras have not always carried. The knowledge, on the part of the writer, that what she put down might eventually be read by people other than its intended recipient. The letter was private and it was permanent, and both things were true at the same time. This knowledge shaped what women wrote and how they wrote it. Most experienced correspondents wrote with a kind of double consciousness, saying what they meant to say while also composing something that, if ever read aloud in a drawing room or a courtroom, would reflect well on the character of the writer. The passion was present, but it was phrased. The longing was genuine, but it was managed. This is why the most celebrated Victorian love letters have a particular quality, deeply felt and beautifully expressed, with a control of language that does not diminish the feeling, but shapes it into something that could survive the light. Not all Victorian women wrote with this restraint. Some letters, particularly those exchanged in secret through sympathetic intermediaries, were written with a frankness that suggests the writers had decided the risk was worth it, that saying the true thing clearly was more important than composing something defensible. These letters are the most alive documents of the period, and the most dangerous ones for their authors. A woman who had written something genuinely unguarded to a man who subsequently behaved badly was in a position that the social system offered very little protection against. The letters were out of her hands. What happened to them was his decision. The receiving of a love letter was its own experience, the arrival of something private in a context where privacy was rare, a document that existed only between 2 people, that had been carried by specific hands from one place to another, that arrived bearing the physical evidence of its journey in the fold of the paper and the seal of the envelope. Opening a letter from someone you had strong feelings about, in the quiet of a bedroom or a sitting room, was one of the few genuinely unobserved moments available in Victorian women's lives. The letter was the space where the social performance could stop for the duration of a read. What a Victorian love letter actually said, beneath the formal language and the careful phrasing and the conventions of the era, was what every love letter in every era has said. I think about you. I want to be with you. I am saying this in the most careful and considered way I can, because the saying of it is the most important thing I have done today. and possibly for some time. The flowers and the fans and the gloves and the stamps and the dance cards and the deliberate pauses had all been rehearsals for this, for the moment when the language of indirection was finally set aside and the words were plain, and the paper held them, and the seal was pressed, and the letter was sent, and there was nothing left to do but wait. And so here you are. You have travelled through drawing rooms and ballrooms and garden promenades. You have watched women say I love you with a flower, say leave me alone with a curtsy, say I've been thinking about you with a stamp tilted 2 degrees from upright on an envelope. You have watched them conduct entire courtships in 30-minute intervals, communicate grief through fabric, and say the truest things they ever said in letters that were sometimes burned before anyone else could read them. You might be thinking, what an exhausting way to live. And you would be right. It was exhausting. It was also, in its way, extraordinary, because what Victorian women built out of the materials available to them was not a workaround. It was a language, a full, complex, nuanced language with grammar and vocabulary and regional dialects, and the occasional untranslatable phrase. They built it because they had to, and they used it because they were human, and being human means finding a way to say the things that need saying, regardless of what the rules are. There is something worth sitting within that. These were women who were told in 100 explicit and implicit ways that their feelings were not the point, that their inner lives were secondary, that the correct performance of propriety mattered more than the honest expression of anything they actually felt. And they looked at that instruction, and they said, very quietly, with a fan or a flower or carefully placed glove, no, we will find a way. We always find a way. The flowers have dried. The fans have folded. The dance cards are in museum archives. The pencils long since lost. The names faded to the point of illegibility. The letters that survived did so by accident or by stubbornness, tucked into the backs of drawers by women who could not bring themselves to burn the one place where they had been entirely honest. But the feeling behind all of it, the wanting to be known, the needing to be heard, the remarkable human refusal to be entirely silent even when silence is demanded, that has not gone anywhere. So tonight, as you settle into your warm bed in your house with its central heating and its lack of mandatory morning dress, and its very welcome absence of mandatory chaperones, maybe spare a thought for the women who stood at windows and promenaded in parks and pressed flowers into books and tilted stamps on envelopes, and said everything they had to say without ever once being given permission to say it. They were heard. Eventually, sleep well.